For 40 long years, the most powerful tech billionaire in the city spent a fortune trying to fix his stone-deaf father, buying every miracle cure and high-end hearing aid money could touch. But it didn't take a world-class surgeon to solve the mystery. It took a maid with a $10 pair of tweezers and a secret of her own to realize the old man wasn't deaf at all. He was being systematically silenced by the very people sworn to protect him. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. The Silicon Shark and the Glass Tomb. Vincent Dowling didn't just run the city, he owned its pulse. Known in the boardroom as the Silicon Shark, Vincent was a man of absolute precision and zero patience. To him, everything was a system to be optimized. But inside his sterile, ultramodern penthouse, a sprawling palace of glass and steel, there was one bug in the system he couldn't fix: his 80-year-old father, Paul. Paul Dowling was a ghost in a designer suit. For 4 decades, he had lived in a world of absolute, stone-deaf silence. While Vincent's servers processed billions of bits of data every second, his father sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at a city he helped build but could no longer hear. To Vincent, Paul was a broken machine, a tragic reminder of the one thing his billions couldn't buy: a cure. Into this cold, silent empire walked Laura Yale. With her hair pulled back in a tight, practical knot and eyes that saw far more than a maid was supposed to, Laura was a woman living on the edge of survival. Escaping a past of forced silence and carrying the weight of her own father's stolen legacy, she took the job at the Dowling estate out of desperation and a hidden suspicion. On her first day, the head housekeeper gave her one chilling instruction: don't bother speaking to the old man. He's a stone. You could set off a bomb in this room and he wouldn't blink. Just clean around him and keep the silence. But as Laura began to polish the cold surfaces of Paul's room, she noticed something the high-priced specialists had ignored for 40 years. Paul wasn't just staring blankly. His jaw was clenched in a specific type of rhythmic pain. When a high-frequency vacuum hummed in the hallway, Paul didn't just sit there, he flinched. It was a tiny movement, a microscopic glitch in his deafness, but it was enough to tell Laura that Paul Dowling wasn't living in a world of silence. He was living in a world of pressure. And as Vincent prepared the paperwork to ship his father off to a high-security care facility, permanently removing him from the Dowling empire, Laura realized that someone wasn't waiting for Paul to get better. They were waiting for him to disappear. Chapter 1. Vincent Dowling's penthouse existed in a state of perpetual winter. Not cold. Exactly, the climate control system maintained a perfect 72 degrees at all times, but sterile in a way that made Laura think of laboratories and operating rooms. Everything was glass and steel and sharp angles that caught the light like knives. The kind of space designed to impress, not comfort. She'd been working there for 3 days before she saw Vincent in person. He swept through the foyer at 6:47 a.m., already on his phone, already moving like a man who viewed stillness as weakness. Mid-30s, sharp suit that probably cost more than her father's funeral, and eyes that assessed everything with the cold efficiency of a machine calculating value. He glanced at Laura the way someone might glance at a piece of furniture, confirming its presence, then dismissing it. "The new maid," he said into his phone, not to her. "Mrs. Chen's choice. We'll see if she lasts longer than the others." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with the quiet finality of a vault ceiling. Laura stood in the hallway, dust cloth in hand, and felt the weight of the penthouse settle around her like a tomb. Somewhere above, Paul Dowling sat in his room, staring at a city he couldn't hear. Below, the machinery of an empire hummed along, powered by patents and innovations that Vincent believed his father had helped create in the days before silence claimed him. But Laura knew better. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, her footsteps absorbed by carpet so thick it felt like walking on clouds. Paul's room was at the end of the hall, a corner suite with windows on two sides, flooding the space with light that somehow made it feel colder rather than warmer. He sat in his usual spot, a leather chair positioned to overlook the Manhattan skyline. 73 years old, still handsome in the way men with good bone structure aged, wearing slacks and a button-down shirt that Mrs. Chen had dressed him in that morning. His silver hair was neatly combed. His posture was perfect, but his eyes were distant, focused on something no one else could see. The other maids, the ones who'd quit, had cleaned around him like he was a statue. They dusted and vacuumed and changed his sheets while talking about him as if he wasn't there. Laura had heard Mrs. Chen doing it just yesterday. Poor thing. Doesn't even know we're here. Such a shame, all that money and nothing can fix him. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway behind Laura, her arms full of fresh linens. "You're the fourth maid this year," she said, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd watched this cycle repeat too many times. "Mr. Dowling, the elder Mr. Dowling, he's 73, profoundly deaf, and—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "So they say, the doctors call it early-stage dementia. He doesn't respond to anyone. Doesn't acknowledge you exist." She set the linens on the bed and moved to stand beside Laura, both of them looking at the man in the chair. "Don't waste your breath trying to talk to him," Mrs. Chen continued. "The son, Vincent, he's tried everything. Spend enough money to cure deafness 10 times over. Nothing works. Paul Dowling is a stone, Miss Yale. Your job is to keep his room clean, make sure he eats, and stay out of Vincent's way when he's working. That's it." Laura nodded, but her eyes were already on Paul. Something about the way he sat, rigid, controlled, like a man bracing against something no one else could see, didn't match the story she'd just been told. She'd taken this job for a reason that had nothing to do with the generous paycheck. Her own father had died 3 years ago, an engineer whose name had been erased from the patents he'd helped create, whose innovations had been stolen by someone powerful enough to rewrite history. Before he died, he'd whispered 2 words to her, "Dowling Tech." Laura had spent 3 years searching, and every lead brought her here, to this glass prison, to this silent man, to this empire built on secrets. Mrs. Chen left with instructions about Paul's meal schedule and medication routine, but Laura wasn't listening anymore. She was watching Paul's hands. They trembled slightly, fingers twitching in patterns that looked almost deliberate. The room felt like a museum exhibit, the silent billionaire's father, circa present day. Everything was arranged for optimal care and minimum engagement. Medical equipment stood ready but unused. Expensive hearing aids sat in their cases, abandoned after years of supposed failure. Books lined the shelves, their spines uncracked, decorative rather than functional. Laura picked up her cleaning supplies and began to work, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Not by Paul, exactly. His eyes remained fixed on the skyline, but by something in him. Some part of his consciousness that was paying attention even as the rest of him performed the role of the broken man everyone expected to see. Chapter 2. By the end of her first week, Laura had established herself as reliably invisible, the kind of staff member wealthy families forgot existed until something needed cleaning. It gave her freedom to observe, to study the patterns of the household, to wait for her moment. That moment came on a Tuesday morning when Mrs. Chen left to oversee a delivery and Vincent was locked in his home office on a conference call that had already lasted 2 hours. Laura climbed the stairs to Paul's room with her cleaning supplies and something extra in her pocket. Her keychain, the one with the small bell Mrs. Chen's keys had jingled with on that first day. Paul sat in his usual spot by the window, wearing a crisp white shirt and gray slacks, looking like a photograph of dignity in repose. The morning light turned his silver hair almost luminous. Laura set down her supplies and did something the others hadn't. She walked directly into his line of sight, positioned herself where he couldn't ignore her, and spoke. "Good morning, Mr. Dowling." No response. His eyes didn't even track to her face. "My name is Laura Yale. I'm going to be taking care of your room from now on." Still nothing. But there was something in the set of his shoulders, a tension that suggested awareness rather than absence. Laura moved closer, watching his face carefully. "I know you can't hear me. That's what they all say. But I'm going to talk to you anyway, if that's all right. My father always said silence is just another kind of conversation." A muscle twitched in Paul's jaw, so subtle that someone not looking for it would have missed it entirely. Laura felt her pulse quicken. She pulled a chair over and sat down, positioning herself at his eye level. "The doctors say you've been deaf for 40 years. Some kind of nerve damage they couldn't fix, even with all Vincent's money. But here's what I find interesting, Mr. Dowling." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her keychain with the small bell. She shook it gently, producing a high, clear tone that rang through the quiet room. Paul's left hand clenched on the arm of his chair. It was fast, a reflexive movement he couldn't control. His fingers pressed down hard against the leather, knuckles whitening for just a fraction of a second. And then his face went carefully blank again, as if he'd caught himself reacting to something he wasn't supposed to hear. Laura's breath caught. She shook the bell again, softer this time, watching his hand. The fingers twitched, fighting against the impulse to react. "You can hear that, can't you?" she whispered. Paul's eyes finally met hers, and what she saw there made her stomach drop. Not confusion, not the vacant stare of dementia, but fear so profound it had worn grooves into his soul. Fear that had been his constant companion for so long it had become part of his cellular structure. And something else. A plea. A desperation that had been building for 40 years with no way to escape. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to speak, needed to speak, but some invisible force held the words captive. His breathing quickened, just barely, but enough for Laura to notice. His right hand moved fractionally toward her, then stopped, as if remembering it wasn't allowed to reach out. Laura leaned forward, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what they did to you, but I'm going to find out." For the first time in 3 days, Paul Dowling blinked. Deliberate. Controlled. A message sent through the only channel he had left. Laura felt something shift in her chest. A combination of rage and determination and grief for this man who'd been buried alive in silence. She reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and placed her hand over his on the chair arm. "I'm not like the others," she said quietly. "I'm not here just to clean. And I'm not going to pretend you're not in there, fighting to be heard." Paul's hand turned under hers, his palm pressing against hers with desperate pressure. His eyes were wet now, tears gathering but not falling, held back by years of practice at hiding every emotion. "Tomorrow," Laura promised. "Tomorrow I'll come back, and we'll find a way for you to tell me what happened. Whatever it takes. But right now, I need you to keep pretending. Can you do that?" One more blink for yes. Paul blinked once. Laura squeezed his hand and stood, picking up her cleaning supplies with hands that trembled slightly. She'd found what she came for, confirmation that her father's whispered words on his deathbed weren't the ravings of a dying man, but a final attempt to point her toward the truth. Paul Dowling wasn't broken. He was imprisoned, and Laura was going to set him free. Chapter 3. Over the next few days, Laura established a routine that gave her access to Paul's room at specific times when Mrs. Chen was occupied with other duties and Vincent was consumed by the demands of his empire. The penthouse operated on such rigid schedules that finding gaps in the surveillance was easier than she'd expected. She used the time to watch Paul, to study the way he moved, the patterns in his behavior that others dismissed as random but she suspected were anything but. He tapped. Not constantly, but regularly. his right index finger against the window pane, always in the same rhythm. Laura first noticed it on a Wednesday afternoon when she was supposedly dusting the bookshelves behind his chair. The sound was so soft it was almost inaudible. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. She froze, her hand hovering over a leather-bound volume, and listened. 3 short taps. 2 longer taps. The pause. Then 3 more short taps. Over and over, like a heartbeat or a prayer or a code no one was listening to. Laura's pulse quickened. She moved slowly, carefully, positioning herself where she could see Paul's reflection in the window without him seeing her watching. His eyes were fixed on the Manhattan skyline, but his finger moved with mechanical precision against the glass. 3 2 pause 3. Again and again. The pattern never varied. It was too consistent to be random, too deliberate to be a nervous tick. She stood there for 20 minutes, counting, confirming. The rhythm was exact, repeated endlessly with the dedication of someone who'd been doing it so long it had become automatic. When Mrs. Chen's footsteps echoed down the hall, Laura quickly resumed her dusting. But that night, alone in her small staff quarters, she pulled out her phone and searched for Morse code patterns. Her hands shook as the answer appeared on her screen. 3 short taps, S 2 long taps, O 3 short taps, S. SOS. Laura stared at her phone, at the simple distress signal that had been hiding in plain sight for who knew how long. Paul Dowling wasn't senile. He wasn't lost in dementia. He was sending a distress signal, trapped in a body that could hear but couldn't speak without revealing that he'd been hearing all along. How long? How many years had he been tapping that desperate message on the window pane while maids dusted around him and doctors examined him and his son spent millions trying to fix what wasn't actually broken? Laura pressed her hand over her mouth, fighting back tears of rage and grief. 40 years. The timeline fit. Paul had gone deaf 40 years ago, right around the time her father's letters to him had stopped being answered. Right around the time the patent disputes had mysteriously disappeared from court records. She couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Paul's finger tapping against the glass. "OS, save our souls. Save me." The next morning, she waited until Vincent left for a breakfast meeting and Mrs. Chen was occupied with the grocery delivery. Then she went to Paul's room with purpose instead of pretense. He was in his usual spot by the window, and yes, there it was. The tapping. 3 2 pause 3. So quiet that if you weren't listening for it, you'd never hear it over the ambient sounds of the city below. Laura moved to his side, positioning herself where he could see her. His finger paused mid-tap. "I see you," Laura said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I see what you're doing. Sus. You've been calling for help, haven't you? For how long?" Paul's hand trembled. His eyes, still fixed on the window, filled with tears that didn't fall. But his shoulders shook with the effort of containing 40 years of trapped screams. Laura knelt beside his chair, not caring if Mrs. Chen walked in, not caring about anything except making this man understand that someone finally heard him. "I'm going to help you," she promised, her voice fierce. "I don't know how yet, but I will. Just keep tapping. Keep fighting. You're not alone anymore." Paul's hand moved from the window to the arm of his chair, and he tapped out a new pattern. Slower this time, deliberate. Laura didn't need to look it up to know what it meant. "Thank you." His finger resumed its familiar rhythm against the glass. 3 2 pause 3. A drowning man waving from the depths, and finally, someone had looked down and seen him. Chapter 4. Vincent returned on Thursday evening with an entourage that shattered the penthouse's usual sterile calm. Laura was in the kitchen preparing Paul's dinner when she heard the voices echoing through the foyer, Vincent's clipped, controlled tones mixed with the deeper voice of an unfamiliar man. "Dr. Reeves is the best in his field," Vincent was saying. I flew him in from Johns Hopkins specifically for this evaluation. If anyone can determine what's happening with my father's condition, it's him." Mrs. Chen appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face tight with something Laura couldn't quite read. Concern maybe. Or resignation. "They're doing another hearing test. Vincent thinks Paul's getting worse. He wants documentation before the transfer to the facility." Laura felt ice form in her stomach. She kept her voice carefully neutral. "When is the transfer?" "Sunday. 2 days from now, right after the gala." Mrs. Chen's voice softened. "It's probably for the best. Paul needs specialized care that Vincent can't provide here, no matter how much money he throws at the problem. The facility Vincent chose is supposed to be the best in the country for patients with advanced cognitive and auditory disorders." Laura nodded, but her hands clenched around the dish towel she was holding. 2 days. If Paul was moved to a care facility, locked behind medical protocols and visiting restrictions, whatever he was trying to communicate would die with him. And whoever had silenced him 40 years ago would win. She found an excuse to pass by Paul's room during the evaluation, needed to deliver fresh towels, she told Mrs. Chen. Through the partially open door, she could see Dr. Reeves conducting tests. He was a distinguished man in his 50s, silver hair and expensive suit, carrying the kind of confidence that came from decades of being right. Paul sat in a different chair for the examination, positioned in the center of the room with medical equipment arranged around him like a shrine to failed cures. Dr. Reeves placed headphones over Paul's ears, adjusted settings on a device that looked like it cost more than Laura's car, and made notations on a tablet. "We'll start with pure tone audiometry," Dr. Reeves said, his voice carrying that particular loudness people used with the deaf and elderly. "Just standard protocol, Mr. Dowling. You won't feel anything." Beeps echoed from the equipment, high frequency, low frequency, varying intensities. Dr. Reeves watched Paul's face carefully, making marks on his chart. Paul sat motionless, his expression perfectly blank. But Laura saw what the doctor didn't. Every time a high-frequency sound played, the kind that would be inaudible to someone with genuine nerve damage, Paul's left hand twitched. Just slightly. A reflexive movement he couldn't quite control. And every time Dr. Reeves asked a question, "Can you hear this tone, Mr. Dowling? Raise your hand if you hear it." Paul's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. The muscle jumped beneath his skin, betraying the effort it took to remain silent. He was hearing everything. Every sound, every word, every humiliating question asked in that too loud voice. And he was terrified. Laura watched through the crack in the door, her heart hammering as Dr. Reeves conducted test after test. Audio response. Tympanometry. Acoustic reflex testing. Each one designed to measure hearing, each one apparently confirming Paul's deafness. But Laura had spent enough time in nursing school to know what normal responses looked like. And what she was seeing didn't match. After 30 minutes, Dr. Reeves removed the headphones and stepped back, making final notations. Vincent stood by the window, arms crossed, watching with the tense attention of a man used to solving problems with money. Chapter 5. That night, Laura couldn't sleep. She lay in her small room in the staff quarters, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through the implications of what Paul had revealed. 40 years ago, someone had implanted a device in Paul Dowling's ear, something sophisticated enough to damage his hearing permanently, to create symptoms that mimicked nerve damage so completely that even the best specialists couldn't tell the difference. And they'd done it to keep him from revealing that the patent that built the Dowling empire was stolen. Her father's patent. Laura got out of bed and pulled out the file she'd brought with her, the collection of her father's papers, his notes, his desperate attempts to reclaim credit for his work. There were letters he'd written to Paul Dowling, pleading for acknowledgement. Letters that, according to the return dates, had been sent right around the time Paul went deaf. Paul had been trying to help her father, and someone had made sure he could never speak about it again. Laura's hands shook as she put the papers away. In less than 48 hours, Paul would be transferred to a facility where he'd be even more isolated, even more unreachable. She had to act fast. But first, she needed proof that the implant existed. The next morning, Friday, Laura waited until Mrs. Chen left for her weekly farmer's market run and Vincent departed for a series of meetings that would keep him away until evening. Then she went to Paul's room with her cleaning supplies and something she'd purchased the night before from a 24-hour pharmacy, a basic medical examination kit. Paul was in his usual spot by the window, but he turned when she entered. Waiting. Ready. I need to look at your ear, Laura said, setting down her supplies and pulling on latex gloves. The right one. You said there was an implant. Paul nodded once, then tilted his head to give her access. Laura's hands were steady as she approached him, though her heart hammered in her chest. She'd done basic physical examinations in nursing school, but that felt like a lifetime ago. Her fingers trembled slightly as she parted his silver hair, examining the skin behind his right ear. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just the normal landscape of aged skin, a few liver spots, some fine wrinkles. The kind of wear you'd expect on a 73-year-old man who'd spent decades sitting by windows. But when she pressed gently, feeling for inconsistencies beneath the surface, she found it. A ridge. Barely perceptible, hidden in the natural folds of skin where the ear met the skull, but there. Hard and linear, about 2 centimeters long. And the skin around it was discolored, not bruised exactly, but inflamed in a way that suggested chronic irritation. For decades of a foreign object, triggering an immune response that never quite resolved. Oh my God, Laura breathed, her fingers tracing the outline of whatever was buried beneath Paul's skin. It's really there. Paul's hand found hers and squeezed. Confirmation and plea combined. Laura pulled back, her mind racing. She pulled out her phone and took several photos, close-ups showing the discoloration, the ridge, the subtle but unmistakable signs that something foreign was lodged beneath the skin. I need to document this, she murmured, more to herself than to Paul. And I need to figure out exactly what it is and how to remove it safely. She paused, looking at Paul's face. His eyes were wet but determined. There's a gala tomorrow night. Vincent's announcing your transfer. Everyone who matters in the Dowling world will be there. Including Marcus Sterling, she didn't say. The man who'd orchestrated this nightmare. Paul's eyes met hers, and she saw determination there. A man who'd been silent for 40 years, waiting for this moment. Preparing for it. Ready to risk everything for one chance to speak. I'm going to need a proper medical kit, Laura said slowly, the plan forming as she spoke. Something that can extract foreign objects. Surgical tools, anesthetic, sutures, everything we'd need for a minor surgical procedure. And I'm going to need you to trust me, Mr. Dowling, because this is going to hurt like hell. Paul reached for her phone and typed with shaking hands, "Do it." Laura studied his face. The resolve there, the desperate hope, the willingness to endure anything if it meant finally being heard. Okay, we'll do this. But first, I need to understand what happened. How did they do this to you? Paul's hands moved over the phone screen, typing slowly. Trusted Sterling. Thought ear surgery for hearing aid. Woke up deaf. Records destroyed. No proof. But there has to be something, Laura insisted. Some evidence that you had surgery when the official records say you didn't. Paul's eyes lit up with something that might have been hope. He stood, moving with more energy than Laura had seen from him, and walked to the bookshelf beside his chair. His fingers stretched toward a leather-bound photo album on the third shelf. You want me to get that? Laura asked. One tap against the wooden shelf. She pulled it down and opened it carefully. The photos inside were old, The colors faded to that particular warmth that marked images from the 1980s. Snapshots of a younger Paul, maybe 35 years old, dark-haired and vital, standing beside a man Laura recognized from her father's old pictures. Her breath caught. "That's my father." They were in what looked like a laboratory, both men wearing white coats, standing beside equipment Laura didn't recognize. But their faces were animated, excited, pointing at something off-camera. They looked like partners, like friends working on something that mattered. Paul's hand covered hers, his fingers pressing gently against the photograph. Then he turned the page. The next series of photos showed Paul in a hospital bed, bandages wrapped around his head in thick white layers. The date written in faded ink in the corner was 40 years ago, almost to the day. June 15, 1985. Laura's pulse quickened. "This is proof. This shows you had surgery." But what caught her attention was the type of bandage. It wasn't the kind used for simple ear surgery or hearing aid fittings, the kind that would wrap around the ear canal and nothing more. These were extensive, covering the entire side of Paul's head, the kind used for invasive procedures. "For implants. The official medical records say you didn't have surgery," Laura said, her voice shaking with anger. "They say your hearing loss was sudden, spontaneous nerve damage that happened over the course of a few weeks. But this proves they're lying." Paul grabbed the phone. "Sterling paid doctor. Fake records. Real surgery in private clinic. Device implanted to destroy hearing. Inflammatory response mimics nerve damage." Laura felt rage building in her chest, rage at Sterling, at the corrupt doctor who'd performed the procedure, at Vincent for never questioning the story he'd been told. Rage at a system that let wealthy men bury their crimes so deep that victims like Paul and her father never got justice. She looked at the other photos in the album, Paul recovering, still bandaged but sitting up in bed. Then later photos showing him without bandages but with a haunted look in his eyes. The last photo in the series showed him sitting by a window, staring at nothing, looking exactly as he did now. 40 years of that same pose. 40 years of silent screaming. "Tomorrow night," Laura said, closing the album with careful reverence. "Tomorrow, we end this. I'll get the equipment I need. During the gala, while everyone's distracted with Vincent's announcement, I'll extract that device. And then you're going to speak. You're going to tell everyone what Sterling did. What really happened to my father. All of it." She turned to face him fully. "But Mr. Dowling, you need to understand, once we do this, there's no going back. Sterling will know we're coming for him. He'll fight. And if we fail, if something goes wrong..." Paul took the phone one more time, his typing firm despite his trembling hands. "Already dead. 40 years dead. Tomorrow I live or I die trying." Laura nodded, her own determination matching his. She thought about her father, about his last words to her, about the patent that should have made him rich but instead made him a forgotten footnote in someone else's success story. "We do this together, then," she said, taking Paul's hand. "For my father. For everyone Sterling's ever silenced." Paul's fingers tapped against her palm, not as this time, but a steady, strong rhythm. A heartbeat. A promise. They had one more day to prepare. One more day before they would either shatter an empire built on stolen genius and 40 years of silence, or fail and lose everything. Laura looked at the photo album, at the evidence of a conspiracy so audacious it had hidden in plain sight for 4 decades. Tomorrow, she would become a surgeon with nothing but basic nursing training and desperate determination. Tomorrow, she would cut the truth out of an old man's skull and force the world to listen. Tomorrow, Paul Dowling would either speak or die trying. Outside the window, Manhattan glittered like broken glass, beautiful and sharp and completely unaware that everything was about to change. The glass cage that had held Paul prisoner for 40 years was about to shatter, and when it did, The sound would echo through every corridor of power in the city. Laura squeezed Paul's hand one more time, feeling the tremor in his fingers. Not fear now, but anticipation. The desperate, terrible hope of a man who'd been buried alive and could finally see light filtering down from above. "Tomorrow," she whispered. Paul's finger tapped once against her palm. Chapter 6. Laura spent Friday afternoon making careful preparations. She contacted her old friend from nursing school, the one who'd left the profession but still had connections to medical suppliers. The conversation was brief, coded in the language of favors owed and questions not asked. "I need a miner's surgical kit," Laura had said. "Something for foreign object extraction. Clean, sterile, and delivered tonight." "Laura, what are you planning?" "Something I should have done 3 years ago. Can you help me or not?" The equipment arrived by courier at 9 p.m., hidden in an innocuous cardboard box labeled medical textbooks. Laura hid it in her room, her hands shaking as she inventoried the contents: scalpel, forceps, local anesthetic, sutures, sterile gauze. Everything she'd need to perform a procedure she had no business attempting. But Paul didn't have the luxury of waiting for someone more qualified. Saturday morning dawned cold and bright, the kind of crystalline winter day that made Manhattan look like it had been carved from glass and steel. The penthouse hummed with unusual activity, caterers arriving to prep food for the evening's gala, florists arranging massive displays of white roses and orchids, staff members Laura had never seen before polishing silver and adjusting lighting. Vincent appeared at breakfast, already dressed in a tuxedo that probably cost more than Laura's annual salary. He moved through the chaos with controlled precision, checking details, adjusting arrangements, speaking in the clipped tones of a man who expected perfection. "The announcement will be at 8, he said to Mrs. Chen, not bothering to lower his voice despite Paul sitting 20 feet away at his usual window. "I want father presentable but not prominent. Seated in the library, perhaps, where guests can pay respects without him becoming a spectacle." Mrs. Chen nodded, making notes on her tablet. "I'll have him dressed and positioned by 7:30. And make sure the care facility representatives have copies of all the medical documentation. Dr. Reeves confirmed the paperwork is in order, but I want no delays with the transfer tomorrow morning." Laura listened from the kitchen doorway, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. Tomorrow morning, less than 24 hours before Paul would be locked away forever. She was carrying a tray of coffee cups to the caterers when it happened. One of the servers, a young woman juggling too many tasks at once, knocked a crystal water glass off the counter. It fell in what felt like slow motion, tumbling through the air before shattering against the marble floor with a sound like a small explosion. The high, sharp frequency of breaking crystal rang through the penthouse, echoing off the glass walls and steel beams. Everyone in the kitchen froze, the kind of communal wince that happens when something expensive breaks in a wealthy person's home. But Laura wasn't looking at the shattered glass. She was looking at Paul. He'd been sitting motionless in his chair by the window, as usual. But the instant the glass broke, before the sound could have possibly traveled the distance to his location, before anyone else had even reacted, Paul's entire body went rigid. His hands clenched on the chair arms. His head turned fractionally toward the kitchen, and his face contorted in a grimace of pain so profound it lasted only a fraction of a second before he forced it back under control. He'd heard it. Not just heard it, reacted to it. The specific high frequency of shattering crystal had penetrated whatever was blocking his hearing, and it had hurt. Laura's mind raced as she set down the coffee tray with shaking hands. The implant Paul had described, it wasn't just blocking sound. It was filtering it, allowing some frequencies through while blocking others. And certain high-pitched sounds were getting past the barrier, probably causing him intense discomfort because his actual hearing was perfectly functional. That's why he'd reacted to her keychain bell. That's why he sometimes seemed to flinch at sounds no one else noticed. He could hear, but selectively, unpredictably, and probably painfully. 40 years of random sounds piercing through his forced silence, each one a reminder of what had been stolen from him. Mrs. Chen was already directing the cleanup, her voice sharp with irritation at the clumsy server. But Laura moved through the chaos toward Paul, watching him carefully reset his expression to that familiar blank stare. Watching him pretend, once again, that nothing had happened. When she reached him, she made a show of adjusting the curtains near his chair. But she leaned close enough to whisper, "I saw that. I know what happened. Tonight this ends." Paul's finger tapped once against the chair arm, hidden from view. Chapter 7. The gala preparations consumed the entire day. By 6 p.m., the penthouse had been transformed into something that looked more like a museum exhibit than a home. All dramatic lighting and carefully staged furniture arrangements designed to showcase Vincent's wealth and taste. Laura helped Mrs. Chen dress Paul in an expensive suit, guiding his arms into the jacket sleeves, knotting his tie with hands that trembled slightly. He looked distinguished, she thought. Like the successful businessman he'd once been, before Sterling had buried him alive in silence. "You'll be in the library during the announcement," Mrs. Chen explained to Paul in that too loud voice people used with him, even though Laura now knew he heard every word. "Mr. Dowling wants you somewhere quiet, away from the main crowd." "It'll be better that way." Better for whom? Laura thought bitterly. Better for Vincent, who could make his announcement about committing his father without having to look at the man's face. Better for the guests, who wouldn't have to feel uncomfortable around the tragic, broken patriarch. But Paul just nodded with that familiar blank compliance, playing his role perfectly. By 7, the guests began arriving. Laura watched from the staff areas as Manhattan's elite flooded into the penthouse. Tech moguls, venture capitalists, society columnists, and lawyers. So many lawyers. She spotted Marcus Sterling immediately. Mid-60s, silver-haired, wearing a tuxedo that fit him like armor. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands, laughing at jokes, completely at ease in his position of power and trust. Laura felt hatred coil in her stomach like a living thing. That man had stolen her father's work, had orchestrated a medical procedure so brutal it had tortured Paul for 40 years. And he'd done it all while maintaining his reputation as the Dowling family's trusted advisor. Tonight, she would destroy him. But first, she needed absolute proof. She waited until the gala was in full swing, until Vincent was occupied with guests, until Mrs. Chen was managing the catering staff, until the penthouse was full of enough noise and distraction that one maid's absence wouldn't be noticed. Then she slipped up to the 3rd floor with her hidden medical kit. Paul was in the library as promised, seated in a leather chair positioned away from the party's main flow. A few guests had stopped by to pay awkward respects, speaking loudly about his condition while he sat motionless. But now he was alone, the library door partially closed, the sounds of the gala muted by distance and expensive soundproofing. Laura locked the door behind her. "It's time," she said quietly, moving to Paul's side. He turned to face her, and the determination in his eyes was almost frightening. He'd waited 40 years for this moment. There was no fear there now, just resolve. Laura pulled on latex gloves, her hands steadier than she'd expected. The basic nursing training was coming back. The careful sterility procedures, the methodical approach to examination. She'd done this before in controlled classroom settings. Never on a real patient. Never with stakes this high. "I'm going to examine the area first," she explained, even though she knew he understood. "Then I'll numb it with local anesthetic. The extraction itself should only take a few minutes, but I need you to stay completely still. Can you do that?" Paul's finger tapped once against the chair arm. She positioned a small LED penlight from her kit and carefully parted Paul's silver hair, exposing the area behind his right ear. The discoloration she'd noticed before was more visible now in the bright light, a patch of slightly reddened, inflamed skin about the size of a quarter. Laura pressed gently, feeling for the ridge she'd found earlier. They're hard and linear just beneath the surface. But as she adjusted the angle of her penlight, something else caught her attention. A glint, barely visible through the thin layer of aged skin. But there. Metal. Laura's breath caught. She leaned closer, adjusting the light, and yes, she could see it now. A tiny edge of something metallic, deliberately positioned just deep enough to be invisible under normal lighting but shallow enough to be accessible. "My God," she whispered. "I can see it. Paul, I can actually see the device." She pulled out her phone and took several photos, documenting the evidence from multiple angles. The inflammation, the ridge, the unmistakable glint of foreign metal embedded in human tissue. "This is it," Laura said, her voice shaking. "This is the proof. But we need to extract it to be sure, to have the physical evidence in hand." Paul reached for her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. His eyes met hers with an intensity that needed no words. "Do it." Laura checked her watch. 7:45. Vincent's announcement was scheduled for 8. She had 15 minutes, maybe 20 if the cocktail hour ran long. She opened her medical kit with trembling hands. Chapter 8. Laura had just finished swabbing the area with antiseptic when she heard the library door handle turn. Her blood went cold. She'd locked it. She was certain she'd locked it. But the door swung open anyway, and Marcus Sterling stood in the doorway, a keyring in his hand and murder in his eyes. "Well," he said, his voice smooth as silk and cold as winter. "This is interesting." Laura's mind raced. She was kneeling beside Paul's chair, medical supplies spread across the side table, a syringe of local anesthetic visible in her gloved hand. There was no way to explain this as innocent housekeeping. Sterling stepped into the library and closed the door behind him with a soft click. "I've been watching you, Miss Yale. Did you think I wouldn't notice?" The new maid who talks to Paul. Who watches him. Who asks questions she shouldn't ask. "I don't know what you're talking about," Laura said, but her voice shook. "Don't insult my intelligence." Sterling moved closer, his polished shoes silent on the Persian rug. "I know exactly who you are. Laura Yale, daughter of Richard Yale, the engineer whose unfortunate death 3 years ago was ruled a suicide. The engineer who spent his final years making wild accusations about stolen patents." Laura's heart hammered against her ribs. "My father didn't kill himself. He was murdered because he knew the truth. Your father was a paranoid drunk who drove his car into a tree." Sterling's voice was matter-of-fact, casual. The police investigation was quite thorough. No evidence of foul play whatsoever. "You're lying." "I'm a lawyer, Miss Yale. I deal in facts, not emotions." He glanced at Paul, whose face had gone carefully blank again. "And the fact is, you're currently attempting to perform a medical procedure on an elderly, mentally incompetent patient without authorization or training. That's elder abuse. Criminal assault. I could have you arrested within the hour." Laura stood slowly, positioning herself between Sterling and Paul. "He's not incompetent. You know he's not. You had a device implanted in his ear 40 years ago to keep him from revealing that you stole my father's patent." Sterling's expression didn't change. "That's quite a fantasy. Do you have any proof of these extraordinary claims?" "The device is right there," Laura said, pointing to the area behind Paul's ear. "I can see it. I have photographs. Medical evidence that will prove." "Prove what?" "That an elderly man has some scar tissue? That you, an unqualified staff member, took inappropriate photos of a vulnerable patient. Sterling pulled out his phone. I'm calling Vincent, and then I'm calling the police. You'll be lucky if you're not charged with attempted murder. No, Paul said. The word was barely a whisper, rusty and rough from 40 years of disuse. But it stopped Sterling cold. He turned slowly, disbelief and horror warring on his face. That's not possible. No, Paul said again, his voice gaining strength. Each word seemed to cost him tremendous effort, forcing itself past decades of enforced silence. Not going to let you in. Sterling's face had gone white. You can't speak. Dr. Reeves confirmed. Dr. Reeves works for you. Paul's hands gripped the chair arms, his whole body shaking with the effort of forming words. Always did. Just like the surgeon. Just like all of them. Paul, you're confused. The dementia. I'm not confused. The shout seemed to surprise Paul as much as it did Sterling. His eyes went wide, as if he couldn't quite believe that sound had come from his own throat. 40 years. 40 years I've been screaming inside. And you knew. You always knew. Sterling's mask of professional calm was cracking. His hand tightened on his phone. Vincent needs to hear about this. You're clearly having some kind of episode. Miss Yale has done something to you. She saved me. Paul's voice was getting steadier now, as if his vocal cords were remembering how to work. She's the only one who saw, who listened. Richard Yale's daughter, just like her father. Too smart for her own good. Richard Yale was a thief who tried to claim credit for Paul's work, Sterling said, but there was desperation creeping into his voice now. The patent was legitimate. The courts confirmed. The courts confirmed what you paid them to confirm. Paul leaned forward, and Laura saw 40 years of rage finally finding its voice. I tried to testify. Tried to tell them Richard was the genius. That I was just the business partner. That the patent belonged to him. And you had me silenced. Sterling took a step backward. This is ridiculous. Paul, think about what you're saying. The strain of the evening, the medication. I remember the clinic. Paul's eyes were locked on Sterling now, burning with intensity. I remember you telling me it was a simple procedure. New hearing aid technology. Experimental but safe. I trusted you. Paul. I remember waking up, and everything was muffled. Distant. You told me it would improve. That it was temporary inflammation. But it never got better. His hands were shaking. Because you designed it not to get better. You needed me deaf. Because I was going to testify that Richard Yale was the true inventor. Laura stood frozen, witnessing the confrontation she'd dreamed about but never quite believed would happen. Paul was speaking. After 40 years of silence, he was finally telling his truth. Sterling's face had gone from white to red. No one will believe you. You're a senile old man who hasn't spoken in 4 decades. I'll have a dozen doctors testifying that this is impossible, that Miss Yale has somehow manipulated you. Then explain this. Laura held up her phone, showing the photos of the implant site. Explain the metal device embedded in his ear. Explain why the medical records say he never had surgery when we have photographs proving he did. Explain why Dr. Reeves is on your payroll. Those photos prove nothing. They prove enough for an investigation. Laura's voice was steady now, her fear burned away by righteous fury. And when they extract that device, when they analyze it, they'll find it was designed to cause permanent hearing damage. They'll find medical records you thought were destroyed. They'll find the truth, Mr. Sterling. The truth that you've been burying for 40 years. Sterling stared at them both, his mind clearly racing through options, through legal strategies, through ways to contain this disaster. Then his expression hardened into something dangerous. No one is extracting anything, he said coldly, because I'm not letting you leave this room. He moved toward the door, clearly intending to lock them in, to buy time to figure out his next move. But Paul stood, shakily, using the chair for support, but stood nonetheless. "Sterling," Paul said, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't held in decades. "It's over." And that's when Laura heard it. Footsteps on the stairs. Multiple sets, moving fast. The library door burst open, and Vincent Dowling stood there, his face a mask of confusion and shock. Behind him, a cluster of gala guests peered in curiously, drawn by the sound of raised voices. Vincent's eyes swept the scene. His father standing, Laura with her medical kit, Sterling positioned between them and the door, the obvious tension crackling in the air. "What the hell is going on here?" Vincent demanded. Paul turned to face his son, and Laura saw tears streaming down the old man's face. "Vincent," he said, and his voice broke on the name. "Vincent, I need you to listen to me. For the first time in 40 years. I need you to hear what I have to say." Chapter 9. Vincent stood frozen in the library doorway, his face cycling through expressions Laura couldn't quite read. Shock, disbelief, hope, fear. The guests behind him whispered urgently, phones already coming out to record what was clearly becoming the most dramatic moment in Manhattan society this year. "Father." Vincent's voice was barely a whisper. "You can speak?" "He's having an episode," Sterling said quickly, moving to put himself between Vincent and Paul. "The stress of the evening, the crowds. Miss Yale has clearly done something to agitate him. We need to get him sedated and transferred immediately." "No." Vincent held up one hand, his eyes never leaving Paul's face. "Everyone out." "Sterling, you too." "Vincent, as your legal counsel, I must advise." "I set out." Vincent's voice carried the cold authority of a man used to being obeyed. "All of you. This is a private family matter." The guests retreated reluctantly, their whispers growing louder as they returned to the party downstairs. But Sterling remained, his face a careful mask of concern with something darker lurking beneath. "Vincent, your father is clearly confused. We should call Dr. Reeves." "Dr. Reeves works for him," Paul said, pointing at Sterling with a shaking hand. "Paid to lie. Paid to keep me locked in silence." Vincent's eyes narrowed. "That's a serious accusation, Father. Do you have any proof?" "Show him," Paul said to Laura. Laura held out her phone, showing the photographs of the implant site. "There's a foreign object embedded behind his ear. Metal. Deliberately placed to damage his hearing and create symptoms that would mimic nerve damage. I have photos of the surgical scars from 40 years ago, scars that don't appear in any official medical records." Vincent took the phone, his expression hardening as he scrolled through the images. "Sterling, explain this." "I can't explain delusions and conspiracy theories," Sterling said smoothly. "Those photos could show anything. Old scar tissue, a benign cyst, natural inflammation." "Then you won't mind if we extract it and have it analyzed," Laura said. "Right now. In front of witnesses." Sterling's composure cracked for just a moment. "That's absurd. You're not qualified to perform any kind of medical procedure. You're a maid, for God's sake." "She's a former nursing student," Paul said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "And she's the only one who saw what everyone else missed. That I wasn't broken. That I was imprisoned." Vincent was staring at his father with an expression Laura had never seen on his face before: vulnerability. Raw emotion breaking through the controlled facade of the silicon shark. "Is this real?" Vincent asked quietly. "Father, is this really you? After all these years?" Paul's face crumpled. "I'm sorry, Vincent. I'm so sorry. I wanted to tell you, wanted to explain, but I couldn't." Couldn't risk you getting caught in Sterling's web. Couldn't risk him silencing you too. Jesus Christ. Vincent turned to Sterling, and now there was fury in his eyes. If any of this is true. It's not, Sterling said firmly. Vincent, think rationally. Your father hasn't spoken in 40 years. Suddenly, the night before his transfer, he has a miraculous recovery? It's obviously a manipulation by this woman, who has some kind of agenda. My agenda is the truth, Laura said. The truth about what you did to Paul. And what you did to my father. Sterling's mask slipped entirely. Your father was a fraud who tried to steal credit for Paul's work. The courts confirmed. The courts confirmed what you paid them to confirm. Paul's shout echoed through the library. I tried to testify. Tried to tell them Richard was the inventor. That I was just providing funding and business expertise. And you had me. You had me. His voice broke, 40 years of trauma overwhelming him. He swayed and Laura caught his arm, steadying him. The device needs to come out, she said to Vincent. Tonight. Before Sterling has time to cover his tracks. Before he can destroy evidence or pay off more doctors or make this all disappear like he did 40 years ago. Vincent looked at Sterling, at his father, at Laura. She could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. The empire his family had built, the legal implications, the public relations nightmare this would become. Then he looked at his father's face, at the tears streaming down the old man's cheeks, and something in him shifted. Do it, Vincent said to Laura. Vincent, this is insane, Sterling started. Shut up, Marcus. Vincent pulled out his phone. I'm calling my personal physician. She'll be here in 20 minutes. Can you wait that long, Father? No. Paul's voice was firm despite his trembling. No more waiting. No more delays. Laura extracts it now, or Sterling makes it disappear. You know he will. You know he has the connections, the resources. I'm standing right here, Sterling said coldly. Then you can watch, Vincent said. And if there's nothing there, if this is all some elaborate delusion, we'll know soon enough. He turned to Laura. Can you do this safely? I think so. I have local anesthetic, sterile instruments, everything needed for a minor extraction. But Mr. Dowling needs to understand there are risks. Infection, nerve damage, bleeding. Do it, Paul said. Please. Before I lose my courage. Before 40 years of silence. Laura looked at Vincent, who nodded once. Then she helped Paul back into the chair and began her preparations. Her hands were steadier than they should have been as she swabbed the area behind Paul's ear with antiseptic. The sounds of the gala drifted up from below. Laughter, music, the clink of champagne glasses. A world continuing on, oblivious to the surgery happening in the library above. Local anesthetic first, Laura explained, her voice clinical to keep herself calm. You'll feel a pinch, then numbness. That's normal. Paul's hand found hers and squeezed. Laura administered the injection, watching Paul's face for signs of distress. He flinched but made no sound. She waited the required 5 minutes for the anesthetic to take effect, using the time to lay out her instruments with surgical precision. Scalpel. Forceps. Gauze. Sutures. Vincent stood by the window, his phone in his hand, torn between watching and looking away. Sterling remained by the door, his face a mask of cold fury. Can you feel this? Laura asked, pressing gently on the numbed area. Paul shook his head. I'm starting now. Stay very still. Laura had never been more grateful for her nursing school training, the countless hours practicing incisions on synthetic skin, the careful instruction in sterile technique, the methodical approach to minor procedures. This was bigger than anything she'd attempted in school, but the principles were the same. Be precise. Be careful. Do no harm. The scalpel felt heavy in her hand as she made the first incision, small, controlled, following the natural fold of skin to minimize scarring. Paul didn't move. Blood welled up, and she blotted it with gauze, working by feel as much as sight. She could see it now, a small metallic object, roughly cylindrical, embedded in the tissue behind Paul's ear. It was tiny, no larger than a grain of rice, but sophisticated in its brutality. "I see it," Laura breathed. "Vincent, come look at this." Vincent moved to her side, peering over her shoulder. His face went white. That's really there. Inside my father's head." "Not for much longer." Laura adjusted her grip on the forceps, angling carefully to avoid the delicate structures of the inner ear. The device was lodged deep, surrounded by inflamed tissue that had built up over decades of immune response. She worked slowly, separating the metal from the flesh that had grown around it. Paul's breathing was steady, controlled. He'd waited 40 years for this moment. What was a few more minutes of discomfort? Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, Laura felt the device come free. She withdrew it carefully, holding it up to the light. It was small, elegant in its engineering, and absolutely damning in its existence. "Got it," she said, her voice shaking with relief and exhaustion. The device gleamed in her forceps, a tiny cylinder of metal and circuitry covered in decades of biological material but still intact. Evidence that couldn't be denied or explained away. Vincent stared at it, his face cycling through shock, horror, and rage. "What the hell is that?" "A jamming device," Paul said, his voice stronger now that the foreign object was gone. "Designed to interfere with auditory processing, to create permanent inflammatory damage that would mimic nerve deafness. Sophisticated enough that no standard hearing test would detect it." "That's impossible," Sterling said, but his voice lacked conviction now. "Is it?" Vincent turned to him, and the cold fury in his eyes was terrifying. "Because it's sitting right there in Laura's hand. Physical evidence that you had something implanted in my father's skull. You can't prove I had anything to do with." "Yes, I can." Paul stood, holding a gauze bandage to his ear where Laura was applying pressure to stop the bleeding. "I remember everything. The clinic. The surgeon whose name you said I'd forget. The recovery room where you visited and told me the complications were permanent. Every detail. Every lie. I've had 40 years to remember." Vincent pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the police." "No." Sterling's composure shattered entirely. "Vincent, think about what you're doing. Think about the company, the reputation. If this gets out, if people know the original patent was stolen, then we'll deal with it," Vincent said coldly. "But I'm not protecting you. Not after what you did to my father. Not after 40 years of lies." Sterling's face contorted with desperation. "I made this family. I built this empire. Without me, you'd have nothing. Without you, I'd have had my father." Vincent's voice broke on the words. 40 years, Marcus. 40 years I thought he was broken. That I'd failed him. That no amount of money could fix what was wrong. And all this time you knew. You did this to him." Laura had finished suturing the incision, working quickly but carefully. The wound was small, clean. It would heal. Paul would have a scar, but scars were evidence. Proof. Truth written on skin. "Done," she said quietly, applying a final bandage. "Mr. Dowling, how do you feel?" Paul reached up to touch the bandage, his eyes closing. Then he opened them and looked at Vincent. "Like I could finally breathe," he said. "Like 40 years of drowning just ended." The sound of sirens drifted up from the street below. Vincent had made the call while Laura worked, and now the consequences were arriving. Sterling made one last attempt to reach the door, But Vincent moved faster, blocking his path. "You're not going anywhere," Vincent said. "You're going to stay here and answer for what you did. To my father. To Richard Yale. To everyone whose lives you destroyed to build your empire on top of their stolen work." Laura held up the extracted device, still held carefully in her forceps. "And we have the evidence to prove it." Two police officers appeared in the library doorway, summoned by the reports of a disturbance at the gala. They stopped short, taking in the scene. Paul with his bandaged ear, Laura with her medical kit, Sterling pale and trapped, Vincent standing guard. "Officers," Vincent said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "I need to report a crime. A 40-year-old conspiracy involving medical malpractice, stolen intellectual property, and the imprisonment of my father through forced medical silence. And I have all the evidence you'll need." He gestured to the device in Laura's hand, to the photographs on her phone, to the photo albums still lying open on the side table. "His name is Marcus Sterling," Vincent continued. "And he's been lying to my family for 4 decades. That ends tonight." Sterling's face had gone gray. He opened his mouth, perhaps to lawyer his way out of this one final time, but no words came. What could he say? The evidence was irrefutable. The victim was standing there, speaking after 40 years of silence, telling his truth. As the officers moved to take Sterling into custody, reading him his rights, Paul reached for Laura's hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "You gave me back my voice. You gave me justice. You gave me everything." Laura squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face. "You gave my father the same thing. Recognition. Acknowledgement. The truth he died trying to tell." Vincent stood by the window, watching as Sterling was led away in handcuffs. His entire body was shaking, with rage, with grief, with the weight of understanding just how much had been stolen from him and his father. When he finally turned back, his eyes were red. "Father," he said, his voice breaking, "I'm so sorry. I should have known. Should have questioned, should have." "You couldn't have known," Paul said gently. "That was the point. Sterling made sure. The lies were perfect. Made sure everyone believed. I was broken beyond repair. Even you. Especially me." Vincent moved closer, and Laura saw the boy beneath the billionaire, the son who'd spent 40 years believing he'd failed his father. "Can you forgive me?" Paul opened his arms, and Vincent collapsed into them, a grown man finding his father after 4 decades of silence. They stood there in the library, holding each other while the sounds of the gala below slowly faded as guests departed, spreading the incredible news. Laura quietly packed up her medical kit, giving them privacy for a reunion 40 years in the making. She looked at the device still sitting in her forceps, such a small thing to have caused so much damage. But that was how evil often worked, she thought. Small, deliberate cruelties that grew into catastrophes over time. Her phone buzzed. A message from Vincent's personal physician, confirming she was 5 minutes away to properly treat Paul's wound and document the evidence. Laura looked out the library window at Manhattan glittering below. Somewhere in this city, her father's name would finally be restored. His patent would be acknowledged. His work would be recognized. And Paul Dowling, after 40 years of silence, would finally tell the world the truth. "Miss Yale," Paul called to her. "Laura, come here." She moved to stand beside the father and son, and Paul reached out to take her hand. "Your father was my friend," he said, his voice steady now, growing stronger with each word. "He was brilliant. Everything I wasn't. And I tried to save his legacy. Tried to testify, to make things right. Sterling stopped me. But you..." He squeezed her hand. "You finished what both our fathers started. You found the truth. And you set us both free." Laura nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Vincent looked at her with something like awe. You saved him. After all the specialists, all the money I spent, all the experts who said nothing could be done, you saved him. I just listened, Laura said quietly. That's all he needed. Someone who would listen and believe him. The physician arrived, and the rest of the evening passed in a blur of medical documentation, police statements, and the slow unraveling of Sterling's 40-year conspiracy. Phone calls were made. Lawyers were summoned, real ones this time, not corrupt ones on Sterling's payroll. Journalists began calling, scenting the story of the decade. By midnight, the penthouse was quiet again. The gala guests had left. The police had taken their statements. The physician had treated Paul's wound and declared him remarkably healthy for a man of 73 who'd just undergone impromptu surgery. Laura sat in the kitchen, drinking coffee and shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline, when Paul and Vincent found her. We need to talk about what happens next, Vincent said, pulling out a chair. For all of us. Laura looked up at them, this father and son who'd been strangers for 40 years, now reunited by the simple act of someone choosing to listen. The truth comes out, she said simply. All of it. My father's patent. Sterling's conspiracy. Everything. It'll destroy the company's reputation, Vincent warned. The foundation it was built on is a lie. Then we rebuild, Paul said. His voice was still rough, but growing clearer with each passing hour. We rebuild on truth instead of theft. On honor instead of conspiracy. We make it right. Vincent nodded slowly. And we start by crediting Richard Yale as the original inventor. His name goes on the patent. His family, he looked at Laura, gets the recognition and compensation they deserve. Laura felt tears prick her eyes again. That's all he wanted. Just for someone to remember that he existed. That his work mattered. It did matter, Paul said gently. It changed the world. And now everyone will know it was his genius that started it all. They sat there in the kitchen as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky outside. 3 people bound together by conspiracy and loss, now united in truth. Outside, Manhattan was waking up to a new day, one where the impossible had happened, where a man who'd been silent for 40 years had finally found his voice. Where justice, though delayed by decades, had finally arrived. And in a small kitchen in a glass tower that had been a prison, Laura Yale held her father's memory close and knew he was finally at peace. The truth was out. The silence was broken. And somewhere, she imagined her father was smiling. And that's how a maid with nothing but courage and a pair of tweezers brought down a 40-year conspiracy and gave a father back his voice. Sometimes the smallest acts of listening can shatter the biggest lies. Thank you so much for watching this incredible journey with me. If this story moved you, if Paul's 40 years of silence and Laura's determination inspired you, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this. Drop a comment below and tell me, would you have had the courage to do what Laura did? What would you risk to uncover the truth? And if you enjoyed this story, check out next story title, where brief teaser. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Until next time, remember, sometimes the truth is hiding in plain sight. You just have to be brave enough to look. See you in the next story.